You're listening to Up an Octave, a podcast by Sonivia, the podcasting agency that believes that women and non-binary people deserve to take up space in the podcasting industry because our thoughts, voices, and stories matter. Here you'll learn how to make dope podcasts that inspire, educate, convert, and most importantly, make your voice shine. I'm your host, Rue Spence, and I'm here to take podcasting up an octave. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Up an Octave and Happy New Year. The new year brings the desire to try new things, and maybe starting a podcast is one of your resolutions. Maybe it's something you've been thinking about for a long time. Whatever the case, I am sharing your crash course in starting a podcast. It can be overwhelming to even know where to start. If you are not super familiar with how podcasting works, how to listen, how to start them, if this is a whole new ballgame for you, buckle up, Buttercup, because we are going to get into it. I'm here to break down how to make the podcast of your dreams. In this episode, you're going to get a super fly by the seat of your pants crash course that is based on what I teach my launch clients for free right here on your phone or in your car or on your computer. Wherever you're listening, that part's not important. But I am giving you this episode because that is how much I want you to start making something dope this year. Grab a notebook and let's get into it. First things first, I believe that there is power in a name. You might already have a podcast name in mind, but you need to make sure that it's not already in use by another show or by another entity. I can't tell you how many times I have had that gut-wrenching frustration of coming up with the perfect name and finding out that it either already exists in podcast form or that it belongs to something that I don't super want to be associated with. If there is a name of either a podcast or an entity that is very similar to the show name that you have in mind, it's going to be an uphill battle with SEO, search engine optimization. If you Google the name of your show and it comes up with something very similar or even kind of similar, it can be tough for new listeners to find your show, especially if it is kind of a common phrase. So unfortunately, I would always suggest going with something that's a little bit more unique just so that you are super findable by your listeners. This is also where I'll say that I don't love podcast name structures that go the blank blank podcast, unless it is a part of a larger organization or it specifies what type of show it is. So for example, the Mediaverse Unwrapped podcast is a podcast that ties in with the Facebook community Mediaverse Comics Unwrapped. There, using the word podcast makes sense because it shows that it is the podcast that is affiliated with this other thing. I also don't see anything wrong with using like a true crime podcast or a comedy podcast. If your name doesn't very clearly specify what type of show people are listening to, I don't see anything wrong with specifying. I kind of think of Applebee's. So Applebee's is obviously a restaurant, but they don't call themselves Applebee's, a restaurant. That would be a little bit redundant. However, they call themselves a neighborhood bar and grill. That right away gives you the idea of what Applebee's is. If I didn't know what Applebee's was, maybe I was from somewhere else where they didn't have them, and I saw Applebee's for the first time, just looking at the outside, I'd probably think it was a restaurant, but I wouldn't necessarily know what the vibe was. I wouldn't know that you can get dollar margs there, right? But having that neighborhood bar and grill, neighborhood makes it sound friendly. Bar, I know I can get my dollar margs, and grill, I can get some tasty food as well. So having that a true crime podcast or a comedy podcast can kind of help set that flag to immediately identify what it is. But the thing is, much like calling something the restaurant, if I'm already on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I know that I'm going to find podcasts. That's what I'm here for. Save the real estate both on your cover art and the name of your podcast by eliminating that word. Think about in the days where we would go and buy CDs. If it was the Backstreet Boys album CD, you'd be like, well, obviously, it's a CD. That's what I'm here for. Saving that space makes it a little bit less redundant. Now that you have a name, it's time to identify your why. And I know you have heard this phrase before. Identify your why. What's your why? Whether it's for your business, to keep you motivated in the gym, having a why helps you stay on course when things get hard. And I hate to break it to you, podcasting is going to be hard sometimes. So that's why you need a why. This is the first step of really making this podcast, this little thing that you have named, something real. And your why isn't just that you like this topic. No, my friend, that is not enough to make it sustainable and to make it attractive to your audience. Think about it like this. If you're starting a podcast about Bigfoot, why? It's not just that you like Bigfoot. Maybe it's that you want to allow experiencers to tell their stories. If you're starting a podcast about skincare, it's not just because you really like skin. Maybe it's because you think feeling good in your skin is self-love. If you're starting a podcast about true crime, what's your why? Because victims deserve voices. Starting a Let's Watch podcast about animated Barbie movies? Why? It's not just because you like Barbie movies, right? It's because you want to highlight how we tell stories for women and girls. Starting a podcast about real estate? Why? You believe that millennials deserve a place to call home even in a market that's against them, and on and on and on. We could keep going over examples until the cows come home. But I want you to get an idea of how that why enhances your show and clarifies it. At the end of the day, the function of your podcast is part of your why. And if you're not familiar with the language, the function of a podcast, you can learn more about the types of podcasts in my first 3 episodes of this show. But to break it down super quick, I have 3 models that I teach and that I think all podcasts can be filtered into. The fun podcast, the fandom podcast, and the funnel podcast. So a fun podcast is kind of just a voice blog almost. And it is maybe you and a friend just getting together to chat about something that you like. You don't necessarily ever intend for it to go anywhere. Quote. You don't necessarily want to make money with it. It isn't something that is going to filter into your business. It's just a way to hang out and to have a hobby. The fandom podcast is not part of a business necessarily, but it is where you talk about something that you are either an expert in or have a passion for. So a lot of like true crime podcasts would be fandom podcasts because you are listening to that show to learn something, but also because you love the hosts. And finally, the funnel podcast. This podcast is a facet of your business or some type of endeavor, and the goal of that podcast is to establish you as an authority and to help people learn about your business. So for example, you are listening to a funnel podcast right now. I am here because I own Sonivia, the podcasting agency. I live and breathe and eat podcasts, and so I get to help teach people how to podcast with this show, but I also offer podcasting services. The function of your podcast informs how you structure it. It also builds on your why. So let's go back to that Barbie Cinematic Universe podcast and say that it follows the fun model. Your why might be, I want to highlight how we tell stories for women and girls while catching up with my best friend. It's super casual and super laid back, but that is your why. Say your Bigfoot podcast follows the fandom podcast model. Your why might be, I want to provide people who've experienced Bigfoot with a place to share their stories because I'm a Bigfoot expert and I'm committed to using my podcast to further Sasquatch research. You may not have a Sasquatch hunting business, but you want to do a little bit more than just have a hobby. This is where you're looking to sell t-shirts and maybe have a Patreon. You are a fandom. You are your own brand. Say that your skincare podcast that we talked about earlier is a funnel podcast. Your why might be, I want to teach people that feeling good in the skin they're in is self-love, and show them how I can teach them how to take care of their skin with my skincare business. My why for this podcast is that I believe that women and non-binary people have stories worth sharing, and that we are worthy of taking up more than 29% and 2% respectively of the industry. I want to make making good podcasts more accessible and also offer additional support through my expertise to the people who are ready to take the next step. Having a strong why will make your podcast niche feel nice and cozy instead of boxed in and restrictive. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Niching down can be scary, and if you're not familiar with that term, it basically means honing in so refined on one specific topic. You'll see this a lot on social media, with branding, with podcasting, and honestly, it can feel really reductive. We contain multitudes, and chances are your podcast does as well. But your why should act as your true north so that your niche doesn't feel too small. Niching down can leave you wondering if you'll have enough to talk about week in and week out. But that strong why statement will help you continue to tunnel in to what makes you curious within that niche. I think that chasing your curiosity is the biggest factor in having a successful podcast. Within that niche, consider who your dream listener is. Flesh them out and make them a real person. Maybe start with a current client of yours or someone who you wish would listen to and fall in love with your show. This is the time to dream big and identify who you want to spend that time with. When you plan your content, imagine what that person wants to listen to or learn about. I think that this is somewhere that AI can help. You can check out my episode, AI and Your Podcast, to learn more about that. Think about how your show will work. What segments will you have? How long will your show be? Will you have guests? Co-hosts? Will you have a random dance break section with a music interlude? The world is truly your oyster, and there are a million different types of shows that you can make. Consider what your audience wants to listen to, but also think about what show feels right for you. Once you identify your segments or the flow of your show, this is when I recommend making a list of as many episode topics as you can. This will help you decide if your idea is actually podcastable. If you struggle to come up with more than 10 or 20 things to talk about, go back and hone in on why you're passionate about your topic. Remember that your audience might be starting from scratch. Things that might seem basic or obvious to you may be brand new information to your listener. So if you're really struggling to come up with a lot of ideas, but you know that you're super passionate, break down your episodes. The chances that you are making your episodes a little too comprehensive. For example, this is a mega quick crash course. I could spend an entire episode talking about every single bullet point that we're covering. I could spend an entire episode talking about how to choose the right name for your podcast. I want to give you all of this information at once, but in general, your episodes can be a lot deeper and a lot less comprehensive to give your listeners the information that they probably don't know yet. Coming up with content ideas is somewhere else that I like to use AI. I think it can help you fill in your blind spots. So if you're struggling to come up with ideas or break your ideas down into more episode length nuggets as opposed to huge comprehensive crash courses like this, you can prompt ChatGPT or your AI companion of choice to come up with topics and see if any of those inspire you. As I mentioned in my AI and Your Podcast episode, I don't love just using AI to create your content for you, but I think it is an amazing launch pad. I am someone who really relies on inspiration. I kind of struggle to get that fire lit, but once something sparks me, I can take off running. So when I was starting this podcast, I came up with 50 different topics for my show, just because I knew that I would get really busy and overwhelmed super easily. I have a baby. She is currently 15 months old and was even younger when I started this show. So I am super busy with her, with the rest of my life, and running a business. I prompted ChatGPT to give me 100 episodes about podcasting. Most of them were not very good, but with that list, it started making me fire in a different way to go, oh, I want to talk about that. And people probably don't know about that. And I'm actually really passionate about this. And so because I had that long, comprehensive list, I just got to take off running and start coming up with ideas in my own words based on what AI came up with for me. I recommend that you come up with at least 20 episode topics before you move into the next step. These don't have to be fully fleshed out with notes, but just identify 20 topics that excite you in your niche. After you get that list, it's time to figure out your tech. Let's figure out how you'll record. I believe that anything worth doing is worth doing right. So I'd highly recommend investing at least a little bit into your show. I don't think that you need to break the bank, and especially if you're just following the fun model of podcasting, I don't think you should spend too much on your show. But good audio quality can make all the difference for a show that succeeds or flops. You can hear all of the gear that I recommend in my podcasting must-haves episode, but I'll break it down really quickly here. I recommend a dynamic microphone for most podcasters. If you're recording at home, these mics are less sensitive than condenser mics, which means they're not going to pick up as much background sound, roommates, dogs, outside noises, cars, you name it. I'm using a dynamic mic right now and hoping against hope that you can't hear my husband and baby playing in the other room. Unfortunately, the most popular mic out there is the Yeti, and it is a condenser microphone. I don't think that this is a bad microphone, but I do think that it is not used appropriately. I think so often it's been pitched as your first podcasting microphone, and because of that wild success, people grab it and they use it to record in their home office or guest bedroom. And unfortunately, it picks up all of those sounds we just talked about. Cars, dogs, outside, whatever you name it. That condenser microphone type is just so much more sensitive. So what I would recommend as a good starter mic is the Fifine AM8. It runs about $50 and it can be used as a USB microphone that plugs right into your computer, or it can be used with a mixer or audio interface later down the road. I think it sounds really solid, especially for this price point. One of the most successful podcasts that I work with actually uses this microphone, and you'd never know it. If you've got some spending money and want to invest in a higher quality mic, but still like the option to either use it as USB and plug it straight into your computer or XLR, I like the Shure MV7. Christine Schieffer from And That's Why We Drink uses the MV7. If you're curious about how it sounds, you can go check out that podcast. I think that it is a great option, and it's at around the $250 mark. So it's definitely more of an investment than the Fifine AM8, but this microphone is kind of an industry standard, and it is going to last you a really long time and grow with your show. Currently, what you're hearing me use is the Shure SM7DB. This is a newer version of the Shure SM7B. The SM7B has kind of been the top dog in the industry for a long time. You'll see podcasters like Drew Afualo of the Comment Section podcast, or Travis and Jason Kelsey on the New Heights podcast using these. And actually, the Kelsey brothers upgraded to the Shure SM7Bs after using the MV7s for a long time. So you can see how once you're kind of a Shure diehard, it's hard to leave. And that's honestly how I would do it too. I would absolutely not recommend just jumping straight into the SM7DB. It sounds great. I think I sound great right now. I'm super happy with it. But you also need an audio interface, and the sound quality just isn't worth the price hike unless you are 100% 10 toes down into podcasting. The mic I'm using is a $500 mic, plus a $200 interface. And that makes this an investment that can definitely be a barrier. So this is my permission to not go all out. Start with a $50 mic. Start with a $200 mic. Podcasting is my industry. It's my job. So I'm okay with this investment. And if I'm being straight up, this microphone was gifted to me from Buzzsprout. And we'll talk about them later. I'd been using the Rode Pod mic before I was given this one. And you can hear the difference in my earlier episode, but truly I like them both. I find that the Shure SM7DB sounds richer and fuller than the Pod mic, but I honestly really liked both of them. I don't think it's worth going into debt over a microphone if that type of investment doesn't feel good. You can always grow later, and I recommend checking out Facebook Marketplace, Mercari, whatever the resale sites you like to use are, and also sweetwater.com, reverb.com. All of these places either have great sales for new stuff or people who maybe started a podcast and decided it wasn't for them. That was a big thing during the pandemic. Maybe they're looking to offload some tech. I've also found some really great microphones on eBay. Just keep an eye out and don't break the bank over podcasting until you know that you're really, really passionate about it. No matter what mic you choose, at what price point, you're going to need a decent pair of headphones. I recommend the Audio-Technica ATH M30Xs. That's what's on my head right now. You'll use these for both recording and editing, so make sure that you get something comfy with good sound quality. You're gonna want wired headphones. Even the best wireless headphones still have a latency issue that lead to inaccurate editing or issues when remotely recording with other people. I am an Audio-Technica girly. I love Audio-Technica. I have been so thrilled with their performance. I did try to snag a pair of wireless headphones, thinking that, I trust Audio-Technica, their latency is probably a non-issue, and I'm traveling a lot, so I want to just have something that doesn't have a cord that I'm tangled up in. I have my daughter. I don't want to get her tangled up in my cords because she likes to hang out with me while I'm working. And I sent them back. They're great for the gym. I love wireless headphones for listening to stuff on the go, but if you are really trying to pick audio apart, they're just not there yet. Maybe that tech will get there at some point, but for really precise editing, that latency, even if it's like a teeny tiny shred of a millisecond, is enough to throw your game off. And when you are cloud recording, whether on Zencastr or Zoom with another person, if there's already any kind of lag, that latency just becomes one more barrier to having a clean and natural conversation. So I absolutely recommend grabbing wired headphones, making sure that they're comfy enough to wear all day, and getting something that has great sound quality. The other thing to consider is making sure that your computer is up to the task. You don't need a flashy computer. I started my first podcast on a regular old laptop. Now, once I got hardcore into podcasting and started my business, then I upgraded to a gaming laptop. But that's just to handle the abuse I put it through, like leaving 457 tabs open at all times. But your regular old computer should be able to handle your audio podcast. Video can be a different ballgame. That's a lot more work on your computer. It demands a lot more out of it. But just for audio, most computers can handle that. A thing to consider is that there aren't a lot of cloud-based DAW or digital audio workstation options that I've really found super compelling. So if you're running like a Chromebook that doesn't have an internal hard drive storage, you may struggle a little bit. I recommend having at least Windows or Mac or something along those lines as opposed to like a Chromebook. That brings us to digital audio workstations, or where you'll record and edit. I use Audacity for myself and for my clients. It's free and super accessible. You don't need to be an editing genius or a computer whiz to make a great sounding podcast either. In the episode, How Much Should You Edit Your Podcast?, I go into editing techniques that I personally use for myself and my clients and that I teach. If you're a little nervous about editing, do everything in your power to make a clean recording so that there's less post-production work to be done. Try your best to record in a soundproofed space. Closets are great for home recording. Prepare your notes so that you don't stumble through what you want to talk about, and take your time. Remember that this is not a live show, so you can restart your sentence as many times as you need to. I actually took a break while I was recording this podcast because I heard my daughter crying, and I didn't want that in the final cut. So I took a few minutes while her dad soothed her, and then we got back to it. You get to start over as many times as you want. No one ever has to hear the raw version of your podcast. Trust me, I cut out all sorts of bloopers on my show. Now it's time to talk about your podcast cover art and branding. Your cover art is small, 3,000 by 3,000 pixels. It's quite literally a thumbnail. It's often seen teeny tiny on someone's phone against a million other podcasts. So you want it to stand out. Choose eye-catching graphics and easy-to-read text. Canva is a great option for making your artwork. This is somewhere else that your name is going to come into play, and why I don't like the blank blank podcast. When you're on that cover art in a podcatcher where everything is a podcast, it's obvious that people are looking at podcasts. So we don't need that word right there. I feel the same way about using podcasty looking artwork. You don't necessarily want clip art of a microphone in your podcast, because that would be, again, going back to the CD analogy, like having a picture of a CD on a CD cover. I know what it is. That's why I'm here. Now, I guess I'm kind of a hypocrite with my microphone, but the whole point of my show is microphones. I talk about podcasting. So if that makes sense for you, do what you got to do. Make your cover art make sense. But if you are a veterinarian podcast and you have a microphone in the corner just because you want to make sure people know it's a podcast, I would suggest to instead put a cat there to show that you're a veterinarian. Don't be redundant with your podcast art. That's what I'm trying to say. The other thing that I see sometimes is people really using their image or their name with their show. If your name is marketable, if your face is marketable, that's great. And if you want to have that human connection, that's also great. But I think sometimes people will have the Rue Spence show, which would be awesome if people knew who Rue Spence was. Also, hi, that's me, by the way, if we haven't met. Good to meet you. But if I just called this show the Rue Spence podcast, no one would know what that means. My name doesn't have great brand recognizability because that's not how I market myself. If anything, I'm known by Sonivia, which is my brand name. But I chose Up an Octave because that is what my podcast is about. It's about podcasting for voices that are about an octave higher than the industry standard of podcasting. If your name isn't super recognizable, if you're not a TikTok sensation, I would consider not using your name. And this may be frustrating because you may want to have people identify your name. That's also totally an option, but you're going to have to work twice as hard to make sure people know who you are, what you stand for, and what you're talking about. Podcasts don't quite work the same way that the Oprah show worked, where people were recognizing Oprah and getting to know Oprah and had, a face to connect with a name. So if you're just some random person like the Rue Spence podcast, no one's necessarily going to know who that is or what that is. So consider choosing a name that has a little bit more to do with your niche. So if your podcast is a totally unique thing, consider making unique social media pages for it. If your podcast functions within a parent company or organization, use branding that is complementary to that thing. So I'll go back to Mediaverse Unwrapped. They have very similar artwork on their Facebook community that they have for their podcast. They'll change the colors, they'll change a little bit of it, but it is still recognizable as being affiliated with that thing. So they wouldn't necessarily want to start a completely separate Instagram account just for their podcast when their podcast is so much a part of the rest of their brand. For example, Sonivia, my company, sponsors Up an Octave. So I just use my Sonivia accounts to promote Up an Octave. If I had Sonivia and I had Up an Octave, and I also had a Bigfoot podcast that has nothing to do with podcasting or Sonivia, I would create a unique account to just focus on that show and that niche. This helps you connect with the right audience for your show. Even if people absolutely love what you're doing, if what you do already is very niche, they're not necessarily going to be the same target demographic as your new show. I think this is also a great time to find your music while you're in your branding mindset. If you like to play around with actually producing music, I love Soundtrap. That is where I made my music and I had a lot of fun with it. I've got my husband beatboxing on it. It was a really good time making that. But if you'd rather just buy some royalty-free music, I think Audio Jungle is a great option. Music is really important to talk about, so I want to spend another minute helping you save yourself some headache and some money. Music is probably one of the biggest ways that podcasters get into trouble. Buy the rights to your music if you did not make it yourself. Attribute it correctly, either in your outro or in your show notes, and you're good to go. I hate to break it to you, but you cannot use Break My Soul as your intro, even if Beyonce is your bestie. Same goes for Taylor Swift. Same goes for some random disco song from 1973. No, 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 no. You will at best get your show taken down, get sent a cease and desist from a record label, and at worst, you'll get slapped with some hardcore fines. So even if you know that this amazing song is perfect for your podcast, it can be like the intro that you imagine. It can be like, oh yeah, that really fits. That's on like my podcast playlist. But it cannot be the song that you use on your podcast. There are all sorts of laws and codes and reasons why that is super, super illegal. And I would hate to see anything happen to your show. So as you're poking around royalty-free music and, of course, buying the rights and attributing it correctly, make sure that the music you choose matches the vibe of your show. I've talked about this before. but I'm not a fan of really corporate sounding music. And I always want to make sure that the vibes are in line. You probably don't want to have super happy, joyful ukulele music to lead into your very serious true crime podcast. Now that you've got your name, your show structure, your music, your art, hopefully you've recorded an episode, it is time to find a place for your podcast to live. You need a host. This is the address that your podcast lives at on the internet. And it's how it gets into all of the listening platforms like Apple and Spotify. So I mentioned them earlier. Buzzsprout is my favorite host. That's where my show is hosted, and I really like the community, the customer service, and the offerings. If you're looking to save some money on hosting, I think that Spotify for podcasters is the best free offering for hosting. Spend some time choosing what feels right for you. You can change your host later, but it can be a little bit of a pain, so I think it's worth it to just spend some time and really identify who's the right home for you. So wow, that was a lot of information. Like a lot. So to make things easier on you, I have created a free checklist for you to download in the show notes that talks about everything I've covered today and helps you visually see all of the things that you need to do to get your podcast going. So you can check the link in the show notes, grab it there, and get started. As a reminder, your homework is to name your podcast, identify your why, what the purpose of your show is, and why it matters. Come up with 20 episode ideas you'd be happy to talk about. Decide what tech you'll use and buy and download it to start getting familiar. Create your art and brand identity, buy the rights to your music, start recording, and gosh dang it, have fun. If you feel like you'd need a little bit more help or want to go deeper into your podcast idea, I would love to talk to you. You can schedule a free consultation by going to sonivia.com, and even if we don't end up working together, I will be giving you actionable steps to get your podcast off on the right foot. I truly just want to help you make something amazing in this new year, and because of that, I just want to chat with you and hear your ideas. So I can't wait to chat more and hear what you are planning. Launching your podcast can feel like a lot, and it is, but you don't have to do it by yourself. Psst, hi, I'm interrupting the show to tell you about something special, a chance for us to connect one-on-one. Whether you're thinking about starting a podcast and aren't quite sure where to begin, or maybe you've got a show already, but you're not sure how to grow, I want to let you know about my free consultations. Yep, that's right. Absolutely free. No strings attached, no pressure, just a chance to chat with your fairy pod mother, that's me, about turning your podcast dreams into reality. You'll walk away from our conversation with actionable steps to take, whether or not we end up working together. Think of it as a gift to you and your show as a thank you for listening to the podcast. If listening to me here isn't enough and you're ready to take the next step, let's chat. Find the link to book in the show notes. Now back to the good stuff. All right, today's question comes from Laura. She says, "Hey Rue, I'm about to launch my podcast, but I'm stuck on the episode structure. How do you recommend planning and organizing episodes to keep it engaging for listeners and maintaining a cohesive flow throughout each episode? Thanks a million, Laura." All right, Laura, I am a total Excel spreadsheet nerd. I have one for my podcast. I have one for my workflow. I have a spreadsheet for just about everything. This is where I've built out my calendar, and it helps me so much for batching my content. I can see what's coming up, play with how episodes fit together. This helps me schedule guests and maintain that workflow. This can also be a helpful place for you to break out segments. If you feel like you have a lot of moving parts within each episode, having a spreadsheet can kind of help you visually see where things go, what you still need to do to make sure that everything is in its proper place. As you continue to go on with your podcast, this will start to feel like second nature the more that you do it, but I think it definitely takes time to get more comfortable. For example, each of my shows start with my intro, the meat of the topic, an ad, and then my listener question, my call to action, and my outro. This works a little bit differently for my Pass the Mic episodes, but generally, I have identified the segments that I have, and now I just do it on autopilot. Until you get comfortable with that, it might help you to have some kind of visual cue so that you know that you are assembling your episodes the same way every time. And don't be afraid to play around. Don't be afraid to get it wrong. I tell people all the time, podcasting is not heart surgery. Even if you mess up, even if you get something wrong, chances are nobody's going to die. The worst thing that'll happen is you embarrass yourself a little bit. So try things out. See what really resonates with your audience, see what feels good to you, and lean into that direction. You may have to try a few different things until you find what feels good and what resonates. Have fun with it and good luck on your launch. If you have a podcasting question you'd like answered on the show, you can email me at rue.sonivia@gmail.com or DM me on Instagram @SoniviaStudios. I'll be back next week passing the mic to Emily Aborn of Content with Character. In the meantime, please share this episode with a friend who's been talking about starting a podcast. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening. And while you're there, drop me a rating or a review, because just like your show, mine needs those to grow. The conversation keeps going, and I share even more podcasting tips and tricks on Instagram @SoniviaStudios. So head on over there, and thank you for helping me take podcasting up an octave.